Hello, and welcome to Wine with Wita, the podcast that is dedicated to engaging with health professionals and caregivers in meaningful discussions. I'm your host, Rita Shamoon, or as my clients call me, Wita. I'm a pediatric speech pathologist, and I am so excited to have you here. Each week, we deep dive into connecting you with caregivers and healthcare professionals, sharing their insights, stories, and key takeaways to help you with your child's diagnosis and your journey. Whether you are a parent, healthcare professional, a lifetime learner, or simply a wine enthusiast, you're in the right place. So let's sit back and relax and enjoy today's episode. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Wine with Wita for 2025. This is the third episode of Wine with Wita. And I genuinely believe the aspect of manifestation has worked wonders for this episode. About 2 years ago, I attended the Gabby Bernstein day or program. It was a Sunday and it was a last minute decision for me. And I asked my husband to watch the kids and I went by myself. It was my first solo attendance and I was very lonely. And then I was looking around for a seat and I just sat next to this beautiful woman. Her essence was just so comforting and she was by herself too. So we pretty much said, hey, let's be solo together. And I was just so mesmerized by what she does to support many children, but also how she supports young adults too. And we just connected via social media, and a few likes here or there led me to asking Lorna Genoud, is that how I pronounce it?
Yes.
Yeah. Um, to come on Wine with Wita because I just found her role incredibly fascinating. So, everybody, please welcome Lorna Genoud to Wine with Wita.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. And everybody, it was Lorna's birthday yesterday. So, if we could just quickly say hip, hip, hooray for her.
They're not as fun anymore when you get old.
Oh, look, we have to keep celebrating and having cake always.
Yeah, for sure.
Don't you do birthday week?
Oh, not anymore.
Not anymore?
I'm too tired to do that now.
No, I'm all about a birthday month because my birthday's in December
Yeah, so
and it's
joint
close to
presents.
Christmas. So I start celebrating at the end of November.
Yeah, I still get joint presents even though I'm January.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Really? Even in January?
Yeah.
That sucks.
I
That's
guess
not
it's
fair.
close
Like, that's the
to Christmas.
oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'm glad you had a great birthday. So, as I said, Gabby Bernstein has brought us together here. And one of the key messages that she taught me or us when we saw her was what you do in the presence of joy is what you will receive. And I genuinely feel that's how Wine with Wita has grown and expanded because I absolutely love gaining different perspectives with how we can help parents support the kids and actually understand their kids better and shape them to be young adults. So, Lorna, I'm just going to discuss your wonderful and extensive resume. Lorna is the founder of the Safe Space Educator and is a dedicated and compassionate educator with over 10 years experience in education and social services. She is committed to empowering and supporting young people, particularly those in out-of-home care, creating trauma-informed and inclusive learning environments. Lorna has extensive experience working across disability and juvenile justice and advocating the rights and well-being of vulnerable young people. Wow, that's amazing, Lorna.
Thank you.
Tell me about who you are, what brought you to the role that you are in, and what you do to support young children and young adults.
Okay. Well, I started off as a teacher. I was trained as a teacher and then I decided to do my master's in international public health because I always wanted to work for the UN and do all of that stuff. And I did a bit of an internship in Uganda and worked over there for about four or so months. Came back and then started working in disability. And I worked with the NDIS on the first rollout in Sydney, actually, in
Mhm.
New South Wales. And then moved across to juvenile justice, and I really enjoyed working in one of the justice centres in Sydney. Did my knee playing soccer, wasn't allowed to work in the centre, was really kind of stressed out about what I wanted to do. And then I started working for a really big foster care agency. And I guess it's funny how life works. It kind of pushes you to where you should be. And my role started off as in a management position, and then I got kind of encouraged to apply for the education position because of my background. And I've been in the role for 8 years now. So um, my role is, I guess I'm a bit of a mediator between the systems, two systems, so the social work system, the foster care system, and the education system, because I understand the education side of things. So my role is quite diverse. I train teachers in how to work with young people who have trauma. I work with individual young people themselves, and I also work with foster care staff and social work staff so they better understand the education system, because interestingly enough, both professions don't kind of have an understanding of each other, and they need to, because we have parental responsibility for a large number of young people. There's quite a few kids in foster care in New South Wales, across Australia, but New South Wales is one of the biggest states. And we have full parental responsibility. And if you don't know the school system, it's really difficult. Um,
Mm.
so I think it's interesting that in a teaching degree, you don't learn anything about trauma, and you don't learn anything about foster care. And I mean, trauma is way more than foster care. You don't learn much about disabilities. You don't learn much about how to work with young people when they have escalations and really important things. But then in social work, you also don't learn in your degree about education and how to advocate for kids in education. So it's a big gap and it's a bit of a niche role, but it's a much needed role. So
Mm,
I
mm,
work across the state in my role, just me. I'd love to have more people because there's a lot of kids, but
mm.
yeah, it's interesting how those both professions don't really learn about each other.
You're so right with the tertiary education doesn't give you this the support and experience that you need when you enter a field working with children. And I actually interviewed a speech pathologist the other day, and you, although getting an undergraduate degree in your profession, it is not enough to say you have experience to recognize trauma,
Yeah,
sensory needs, wounds of a mother or a childhood traumas as well. And this is where I find gaining that extra professional development and working with a vast range of kids expands your clinical experience, but also teaches you so much about, teaches you so much more than what we're taught at university. I'm
yeah,
really interested in when you mentioned teaching kids like foster kids versus like a typical Department of Education system. What are the keynote differences between the two? In your,
between the foster care system and the
and then like
education
just
system.
yeah, when
Um,
you said
do you mean like the systems in general, like how
yeah,
they run?
and how you
Um,
said they don't yeah.
well, I guess the foster care system is, well, tries to be more trauma informed, and a lot of our staff are trained in trauma informed practice. We do have mandatory trainings that we do for staff before they work with children, whereas in it's actually not mandatory for teachers to do a trauma informed training course or anything in their PL. But
How
there
come?
is, because at the moment there's actually a teacher crisis. There
Mm,
actually is, like there are a lot of teachers that are leaving the profession because it is quite a saturated profession. There's a lot of high needs kids after COVID. I have noticed
Mm,
a lot of increase in behaviors, in attendance, in engagement, because the system is a system that's been around and hasn't really changed since like the 1920s. So you're trying to educate children and using kind of the same methods that you were using 50, 60 years ago. And our kids just can't concentrate and they can't engage in that type of learning. So there has been a bit of a crash in the system, and I can see it across because I work across a lot of schools. But also, um, they don't want to burden the teachers with extra training because they have so much stress at the moment. So that's why I've been told by people in the department that it's not a mandatory training. Whereas my point of view is if it was a mandatory training, then the job would be easier because people would have a better understanding of how to manage behaviors. Whereas now I think it's, people are kind of running around with their heads off a little bit and working in a crisis mode rather than a preventative sector, and it's a bit
mm.
messy at the moment.
You said two really good points there. The kids with special needs is on the rise.
Yes.
And I've noticed that in my profession too. I've been practicing for over 15 years, and the clients that I treated earlier in my career have substantially increased now,
Yeah.
and their needs are far more complex now. I'm noticing many children have multiple diagnoses. So you might have autism associated with ADHD, or intellectual disability associated with language difficulty impairment too. But I'm also noticing kids are getting diagnosed far younger
Yes.
than I did a long time ago. So that was the first point. The second point is COVID. I really believe COVID was a trauma in itself
Yep.
that has shaped interaction, childhood development,
Yep.
social development, emotional development, and where I feel, despite that's over, we are now seeing, for me particularly, I'm now seeing these kids and their behaviors are very different. They're very
Yes.
different to what I've noticed in the past. And I feel like that comes back down to the social and pragmatics and emotional regulation, all of those aspects, which makes me actually question, is it a true diagnosis, or
Yeah.
is it or is it an impact of trauma where we need to support the child and the parent with their emotional connection? So it's like all these question marks are popping, and I guess we don't know the answer, but
Yeah.
time will tell. What's
I
your
think,
take on that? Yeah.
yeah, so for me, I think, well, what I saw, I worked all through COVID. I worked with
What
young
did you?
people. Yeah, I worked with young people, helped them with their learning. A lot of people didn't want to go out, but I was fine too, and I was happy and
Mm,
healthy and still safe to this
mm,
day.
mm,
But
mm.
um, it was really difficult to see the stress on the kids and the pressure of the online learning, because for our young people, well, the young people I work with, they struggle with learning in class. So I had kids say to me like, this teacher wants me to do freaking French homework, but I can't even speak English. So, like,
That's so true.
and they were expected to do things. Like, I remember I sat with one of the kids who was in year 8 at the time, and we did this science experiment, and they had to do a cell, and we had to get stuff around the house, and she just didn't want a bar of it and didn't want to do it. Like, it's not engaging. Who wants to look at their screen and do stuff that their teacher's telling them to do, and they're confused, they don't know what's going on. A lot of our kids couldn't see their families because they do like
Mm,
contact schedules with their parents normally, so they weren't able to see family, they weren't able to connect to other people. They're already isolated being in foster care and being in a trauma background. Some people didn't like their carers, so they were stuck inside with their carers. So it was a really traumatic time for our kids. And I did this experiment with this kid. She just didn't want to do it. We ended up finding a phone cord and some Skittles and made this makeshift kind of cell. And her teacher wrote back, that's not good enough. You need to do better. And she just lost it and was like, F
mm,
this, not doing it anymore. And she just refused to do any online learning. And it was a little bit like that with a lot of the kids. They refused to do it because they weren't getting any engagement, any positive feedback. It was, kind of like, you need to get this done, or, you're going to get a strike next to your name. Some of the teachers were calling kids out by names, and I had to kind of reach out to schools. Look, not all schools were like that, but I think it was quite a negative experience for kids, and they were already feeling stressed, like, what's going
Mm.
on? Why can't I play sport? Why can't I see my family? Those kind of questions. And then, like, I was really annoyed at that teacher because I was like, come on, she tried.
Is
Like,
that a
who?
common theme that you notice with a lot of foster kids? With
Yes.
that negativity associated with their performance?
Yes, and I think that's because, as you're aware, trauma kind of brings out behaviors, and then people see the behavior as a behavior rather as communication. So they
Yeah.
see that kid, and also, and this is why my role is important, because I encourage social workers or case managers to share information with teachers, because a lot of the time the deputy might know that they have a trauma background, but their teachers won't. So then, they're mucking up in class, they might be rude to the teacher, they might kind of talk back, and the teacher's probably thinking, this kid every time is doing this to
Mm.
me. But when they actually find out the background of the child, they're usually a lot more empathetic. So I think there needs
Mm.
to be more education around talking to staff and specific teachers, because if you don't know, you don't know, right? And you
Yeah, you
don't
don't
know
know
how
exactly.
to. And I think the mood really changes when I do those kind of trauma-informed teaching practices with whole staff, because for me, it has to be the whole staff. It has to be the gardener, it has to be, the cleaning lady. Everyone needs to understand trauma, because if they don't, then, you're gonna get someone, and uniform is one thing that ticks the kids off a lot, like,
Really? Like,
they
wearing a
might.
school uniform?
No, like, for example, they might be having a bad day, they've had a hard time, they might have had a contact, they've come to school, they might be, getting to school is difficult enough, and then a
Mm.
teacher or a staff member might say, "Why are you wearing the wrong jumper today?"
Yeah.
You're not allowed to wear that jumper to school, and it's just moments like that kick kids off. So that's why I think it's so important to train all staff in trauma, like everyone
Yeah.
at the school, the bus driver, everyone.
Lorna, you come with such wonderful insight into a different world to many families that are listening to this podcast. Could you give me an example of what it's like for a foster kid? Like, for example, they've been through so many homes, and that is an impact in itself. And they've probably been to a few different schools. Can you give me, without identifying anybody's name, of course, but give an example of a young child and how what their life looks like or looked like, and the impact of that change and lack of connection with an individual have for that child?
Yeah, well, I guess when I discuss this with people, I talk about Erickson's stages of development, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it talks about, 0 to 1 is when you form trust, and, different stages in your life, you form different things. And if you're born into a household where, you know, usually with a secure attachment, your kid might run away, they'd turn around and look at you, and you'd be there. They'd call
Mm.
out to you, you'd be there. Whereas these kids might be crying out for help and no one's there for them. Or they might be abused by someone they're supposed to trust. And then they're then removed from that place and put with strangers that they don't know.
Mm.
And then often in care, kids are re-abused, or things happen and they have these behaviors because of their trauma, and then the carer's like, I can't do this anymore, and then they're
Yeah.
changed to a different placement. And we have kids in residential care which have gone through, one of my kids have gone through about 15 different placements, and she's, 11, and then she's in, a residential home, and you've got different casualized staff coming in and out of the house every day. And then you go
I
to
guess there's no
school and someone,
consistency.
yeah,
Yeah, there's no
go to school
consistency
and
of that
someone pulls
person.
you up on your socks, so you just lose it, kind of thing. So the kids that do really well are the kids that have a carer that stays with them for the majority of their time in care,
Mm.
which is kind of simple. It's that relationships stuff, that trust, and they're able to develop those things because they have that, whereas the ones that are moved around can't because
And
they're
how old are
constantly
these kids? Like,
liable.
what age did they are
Um,
they mo
so we have kids from babies that come
Mm.
into care to I work with school age children, but yeah, I do sometimes work with younger kids if for school readiness and stuff like that. But yeah, we have 0 to 18,
Mm.
and
And
then
what's the statistics? Like, is it I'm assuming it's growing. It's a growing number.
it has grown. Um, I think I'm not sure off the top of my head in New South Wales. I don't want to give you the exact number because I'm not
No, no, no,
sure.
like a okay, just say how yes, it's grown, but what do you have, like, a rough estimate as to how much or how
I don't know
many
the exact percentage, but I know that it has grown, but that could be due to a range of different things. We have better systems in place now, like
that are
back
identifying it? Like, yeah.
yeah, back in the day,
Mm.
if police were called to a domestic violence kind of dispute and stuff, like it wasn't flagged, whereas now domestic violence is much more recognised. People understand the impact of it more, and it is kind of something that is flagged, and
Mm.
things like that are flagged when there's police call outs to homes, there's flags. So it is kind of better identified. So I don't know if the statistics of it
Mm.
potentially getting higher is relative to, a need. It just might be we understand trauma more and we understand what's right and what's wrong of it.
Yeah. I wanna reflect on a moment that happened to me at university. I was, on placement in a rural town. And it's interesting, university teaches you all the ticks and the checklists that kids need to have. And when you're in a metropolitan area like Sydney and you're seeing different range of kids, though they tick that criteria. But I found when you're in a rural area, it's not as frequent as what you would have it here in Sydney. So there was this one boy I met, he was probably 3, 4, and he was just a punk. He didn't want to engage, he didn't want to play. But when I finally engaged with him, his voice was so husky. Like I couldn't understand him. He was talking like this the whole time. And my mindset went to immediate, he has to have voice therapy to help support his vocal care. And then I developed this whole program and we tried to commence treatment, but it just didn't work. But over time, I had to understand where he came from to understand his behavior. And it wasn't, and I was getting frustrated because this child wasn't engaging with me to complete the task. Over time, I realized his voice was like that because his abusive father, who he was no longer in home with, would always tell them to be quiet, otherwise he'd get punished. So he had learnt the behavior to talk really quietly and whisper, so there was no consequences to his actions. And I think that was such a pivotal learning moment for me, that
Yeah,
behavior is always communication, and never
yeah,
assume a child is identified through their behavior, because there is so much more than what they are showing you. And so
yeah,
in that instant, I threw the voice therapy out the window and I just worked on being that person for him for the duration of the placement, just so he can feel safe, comfortable, and feel a sense of belonging as well.
yeah. And that's a really beautiful story because it kind of hones on, and I know it's a simple thing, but in my work, my first thing with everyone I speak to is relationship. And
Mm.
sometimes people think, oh, I have relationships with my students, but one of my favorite quotes, if a kid doesn't like you, they're not going to listen. So unless you have that relationship with someone, like they're not going to learn from you, they're not going to want to listen to what you have to say. Like even think about it, when you're a teenager and someone would give you a lecture, you just kind of switch off if you weren't
Mm.
kind of connected with that person. Like we need to have relationships with kids, and if we have a relationship with a kid and they feel safe, and that's the same with with how your brain works. Unless you feel safety, you can't actually reach the emotional part of your brain, and then unless you reach that part of your brain, you can't reach your prefrontal cortex for thinking. So unless you have those three things within a classroom or within a learning environment, you can't physically, cognitively learn. So that
See,
relationship is important.
So I guess see how you said before, many people say, "Oh, we have relationships," but they actually don't. What
Yes.
advice could you give health professionals and parents and also teachers with how they can build a r a relationship with a young child to support their learning and emotional development?
I think definitely seeing if this behavior is seeing beyond the behavior and seeing behavior as always a form of communication, but also I think we are quick to judge sometimes. Like one of the points you made before in one of your learnings in the rural town about the speech, um, sometimes I have kids who are in kindergarten that get suspended for using the C word or using,
Oh,
the F word or whatever, but it's a learnt behavior. Everything that a child does is a learnt behavior. So if they're negative towards you, if they call you a bitch, if they, whatever they're doing it because that's their learnt behavior and that's the only way they know how to communicate. So until
mm,
I think it's really important that we understand our own triggers, because if we don't understand what triggers us, then we can be quick to react. And then if you treat pain with pain, then you're never going to get a relationship.
yeah.
So um, I really try and encourage people to understand their own triggers. Like, I don't like being spoken over when I'm talking, and I've worked on that. So when I'm spoken over, I don't kind of shut down or something when I'm talking to a kid. Like, kids will say stuff sometimes to really hurt you, and that can affect people, but if they don't know that that's their trigger, then they can't work to build a relationship with that child, if that makes sense.
That's a big job, understanding your own triggers. Yeah.
Yes.
And it actually makes me then reflect on our tertiary education that we need to have more emotional intelligence and
Yes.
understanding of trauma informed so we could be the best health professionals and best teachers for our kids because it's like failure and failure together. And one
Yes.
thing you actually said beautifully there, you can't treat pain with pain. And that just
Yes.
pulled a heartstring when you said that. This is such a really abstract question. What tips could you give the listeners if they are confronted with a child that does swear at them or does use terminology that's not appropriate? Naturally, people would say that's not right and enforce some discipline. But from your perspective, what would be the best thing to do from that point of view?
Nothing's personal. Everything
Nothing
that a
personal.
child
Mm,
says to you, if you take it personally, you're never going to get anywhere. Um, I understand that there sometimes needs to be obviously needs to be consequences, and this is a word that I really struggle with schools and when I deal with trauma kids, is the word consequences, because when someone is in a heightened state, and I talk about it and I actually show kind of videos of professional athletes smashing their rackets in a moment. We all have our own triggers, and when a young person's triggered, our brain actually can't function at a cognitive level, so we say things or we do things that we don't actually know what we're doing. So
mm,
until you understand the brain, you need to understand that a reaction like that, if you're telling a kid, if they swear at you and you say, don't swear, swearing's wrong, you're going to be suspended, there's a consequence, they can't hear you. They actually can't hear you. So I think there's a learning moment after you repair the situation, but in that
mm.
moment, you cannot teach or give a consequence to an action, because a kid won't hear you. You will further escalate them. So I think
So
you
we
need
just
to
so
have
giving
that
space.
space, but
Yeah.
still that co-regulation, because a lot of kids from trauma need co-regulation. Have a safe space, use a calm voice, and it's hard. Trust me. Like, I've had kids say the worst things. I've had a kid try and steal my car. I've had kids do all sorts of things, and to keep calm in that moment, you really have to self-talk. Um,
Yeah.
but unless you're calm, you won't be able to co-regulate. And when kids are in that really heightened space, that's when they need us the most to co-regulate with
Yeah.
them. So I
It's
think
funny,
it's
just before our chat today, my daughter had wristbands on her legs. And it was like she was trying to hide something from me. And naturally, I would have said, "What's going on?" Cracked it, la la. But I actually took her to another room and said, what have you done? And she was plucking all the hairs off her legs.
Oh,
And it actually took me back to when I did that as a child and my mum was screaming and losing it at me. But then I sat her down, acknowledged it, was calm, explained the consequences of her doing that. And for her age, she's still quite young. But it was so interesting how when it was my time and how I was dealt with it versus to when my daughter's time, and the importance of co-regulating
yeah.
myself in order to connect to her. Because if I was in a heightened state and because she's in a already fearful heightened state, we weren't going to get anywhere.
Yeah, and you've built a further connection with her. She probably feels she can talk to you about things
Yeah.
now, and she's
Opened
not
up in
gonna
so
get
many
in
other
trouble.
avenues. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. So true. So in terms of what other things could we support with teachers to help building those beautiful relationships in the classroom and also for their learning?
I think teachers definitely need more support in the system. I think the system is impossible. I think it's really difficult because in order to get extra funding, you need a diagnosis. And as we know,
Mhm.
um, not all diagnoses get that much funding either. And then you've got a lot of kids that sit in between a diagnosis and, don't get that diagnosis. It's also expensive to get kids diagnosed. So families that might not be able to afford it, does that mean that their kids shouldn't get support in school? So you've got all these teachers that are trying, because I genuinely believe that teachers are trying, but
Yeah, they are.
they're given a class of 30-ish kids. 5 might have autism, 6 might have trauma, and trauma is not just out of home care, trauma is lots of different things.
Mm.
Um, a lot of them have gaps, significant gaps in their learning because of COVID. You've got a curriculum that I personally don't believe sits or is geared or is relatable to kids. I don't think that kids connect with the curriculum anymore. You take kids from a really nurturing primary school, one teacher, one classroom environment, you send them to high school, 7 different teachers, changing classes all the time. Kids are in their heightened state already before they even go into the classroom because of the way it's kind of structured. And then you've got
Mm.
7 different personalities in high school plus teachers. You might have one teacher that's really compassionate. You might have one teacher that's really curriculum, um, subject driven. You might have another teacher that's chilled. Another teacher might be strict. That's a lot of
That's a lot of
personalities
balance.
you have to deal
Yeah.
with in one day. And then you've got kids who are teenagers that's it's actually proven that their brains kind of shut down in their teenage years and they go back to kind of like a toddler brain when they're developing. And then you're telling them to do all these things, they're experimenting. It's just a really difficult system. And I don't think it's an up to date system. So there needs to
Mm.
be a system review because it's really difficult for teachers to deal with that.
We've really highlighted teacher burnout, exhaustion, the rise of diagnosis, and the need these kids so desperately need. What could we do to support our kids now, despite building relationships that you mentioned on your social media page about understanding learning styles? That's one
Yes.
aspect. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think understanding learning styles is important because some kids learn through written stuff. Some kids are more kinesthetic with hands on. Some kids are more auditory learners through listening. So I find in primary school, there's a big mix, and
Mm.
kids are more engaged. There's more games based stuff. So, games based learning is actually another scientifically proven method to increase the participation and engagement of kids. And then when we get to high school, some teachers do it, but because they have so many different classes every day, so many different year groups, they're not just teaching like a year 7 or a year 8. It's hard to kind of prepare all those different lessons. So we're
Mm.
not using as much as a mix. I mean, some teachers do it really great. And I think that's the difference between a really, really good teacher and a teacher that might not be as engaging as a teacher that puts all those different learning methods in their teaching. And it's hard to do because
Yeah.
um, sometimes the lessons might not even work. You might think you've got the best lesson in the world and it just kind of goes to
Bingo.
shit. But if you
Mm,
really are trying and you're looking at the evidence-based practice, you're having brain black breaks in your classroom because realistically we only can focus, kids can only focus for about 20 minutes. So you've
yeah.
got 50-minute lessons and you're making kids sit there for 50 minutes. It's a long time. So, if you're incorporating all that, because trauma-informed teaching practice actually helps all kids, not just kids from a trauma background. Like it's good for kids to have a break every 20 minutes. It's good to break up the lesson with something auditory or something visual or,
Mm.
different kind of learning methods. I think
I
it's
should
when
have
there's
asked you this. So I should have asked you this question initially. What is trauma informed practice and
yeah.
how can we implement it?
So trauma informed practice is quite broad, but it's basically
Mm.
understanding how trauma affects the brain. That
Mhm.
it's actually because I think trauma's a word that doesn't kind of illustrate the impact of what it does. So
Yeah.
some kids that have been through complex trauma, because all kids that are in care have been through complex trauma, which means it's more than one form of trauma. So whether that's physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, it will be more than one. So complex trauma is that type of trauma, and it actually affects the brain and how the brain
Mm.
reacts to different situations. So trauma informed practice is understanding that and creating those things that I said before around safety in the classroom.
Mm.
Um, you know, creating spaces where kids understand their emotions, where kids understand a fight or flight response, a freeze response, those kind of things. So it's really understanding, I guess, physiological responses to how our brain reacts to trauma and
Mm.
what our body how our body reacts, because it's a whole neurological response. Like I've had kids who can hear things that I can't hear. I had a kid that I was visiting once in a juvie center, and she was I was in a cell with her, and she heard something and she said, "Oh, I want a size 4." And I was like, "What?" And there was someone about 400 meters away that was sorting through the new shoes that had come in, and she could hear that. And I couldn't
Why
hear
could
that
she hear them?
because in trauma, when kids have grown up in significant trauma, their amygdala is something in the brain that creates the stress response. It develops first in our brain. So her brain has developed to be hypersensitive to noise to keep her safe. So she's able to hear
Amazing.
things that I couldn't hear. Like sometimes kids can hear things that we can't hear or see things, and they sense things because their body and their brain has prepared them to run or to hide or, to keep themselves safe from trauma. And that's why safety is such a big word
So
when,
important. Yeah.
yeah, when working with kids from trauma.
So that I guess the concept of safety is just to keep that consistency there and building that trust and always being present for the child so their nervous system is also regulated.
Regulated, yeah.
Yeah.
And that, like, because the word trigger is hard, because sometimes teachers will say, well, what's his triggers? But sometimes I don't know,
Mm.
because you don't
Mm.
know what every kid's trigger is going to be. Sometimes I've had a point where a song might have come on and that's triggered a memory, and
Or a
the
smell.
child, yeah, or a smell, and the child doesn't even know
Mm.
what it is, and it's kind of like created a reaction. Or, I've had kids who were getting in trouble at school because they were stealing food from other kids' lunch boxes and hoarding it. And I had to explain to the school that it was because they weren't given food as children. They weren't naughty, they weren't stealing. It's because their brain was telling them, you don't know when you're going to eat next, just take every food,
Mm.
every bit of food. So it's so interesting how our brain works and creates these behaviors, because our body's telling us you need to stay safe.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
relationship regulation and reasoning is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. This is just fascinating stuff, Lorna. Like it's beyond the diagnosis, right? Like
Yeah.
the diagnosis is just for fun. For me, it's just funding. That's how I. But it's so much more than what the child is identified by. And in my head, I'm thinking in my practice, where I really stress the importance of connection creates that communication.
Yes.
And behavior is always communication. And in my practice, it's about following a child's lead, not your lead. They don't do what you do what they do, using
Yes.
their interests and play and engagement to get the next goals addressed. What other things can we do to help families to support their kids and emotional well-being too, besides what you've mentioned before? Are there any other tips?
I think the example you mentioned before was really nice with your own child around
Mm,
that connection. Rather than getting a child in trouble for something, try and understand why they've done it. Um,
mm,
I've, I'm actually a facilitator in a course and I've done it. It's called Tuning into Teens. And I'm not just talking about teenagers, but teenagers are, predominantly the ones with the higher behaviors that I see. And it's around understanding how the teen's thinking rather than how we would solve a situation. So if a teenager's, was caught vaping and you're really annoyed about it and they've come home and you're trying to deal with the situation, vaping's bad, blah, 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 blah. Yes, but what are they thinking? Why are they vaping?
mm,
And we need to kind of put ourselves in that position as a teenager again, because I know I did stuff as a teenager that I wasn't
mm,
supposed
mm,
to do.
mm.
And I didn't do
It's
it.
about
Yeah. I
it's
didn't do
about
it.
understanding the root of the problem, right?
Yeah. And I
Rather than
didn't.
look at the behavior. Mm.
Yeah, like you didn't as a teenager, you didn't do stuff to be like, "I'm gonna really piss my teacher off." I mean,
No.
sometimes I did, but, like it's
I
more.
put glue on the teacher's chair.
Yeah. Yeah, you do it kinda more to impress your friends or get connection with people
Get
or,
connection.
you know, um, try and be cool or try something different, or you might be crying out for attention, like these or connection, 'cause I don't like to use the word attention, it's more connection seeking, so a
Connection
lot of
seeking. Yeah,
behaviors
absolutely.
connection seeking. So I just think trying to understand, because obviously if you have a child and they're vaping, you're going to get upset and think, I don't want my child to vape. But rather than saying don't vape, it's more about like, well, why are you vaping? Like, you're not in trouble. I just
Mm.
want to understand, um, why you're doing this. And you still could get a fuck you or leave me alone.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
as long as you create that space for them to feel comfortable talking to you,
Yeah.
because I think the hardest thing for teenagers, because teenagers, their world is their friends. It just is for teenagers.
Okay. Mm.
And friends come before anything else most of the time. I see that. But it needs to be a space with, I'm not going to hide stuff from my carer or my parent. I know that I can speak to them without getting in trouble.
Yeah. Creating that. And that starts much younger, not in the
Yeah.
teenage years, much younger. You know what came to my head? How you said you were actually going to do a presentation to support teens or families that have teens. Have you considered through your business to have some sort of masterclass? Because
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
even thinking I want to attend this when my daughter starts, when they hit their teens.
Yeah, I wanna do some stuff like that.
Yeah.
I have done similar stuff in my work, but obviously my own space, I wanna kinda create opportunities for people to talk through this stuff, because at the end of the day, most parents are good parents. Obviously, I see the other side of it, and
Yeah.
even the other side of it, I think most I believe truly everyone in the world wants to do good. Everyone wants to be good. No one wants to, flunk out of school or not have a
Mm.
job, or, I don't think these are choices. It's more around like people's capacity, their skills, how their childhood might have been. So I genuinely think every single person wants to do good in the
Yeah.
world. It's just circumstances sometimes affect that. So I think
Yeah.
everyone wants to do well. And I talk about in some of my training around yelling, and I've had teachers put their hand up and say, "Well, I don't yell in my classroom." Everyone yells. We're
Everyone knows
human.
I yell.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
we're
always yell.
human.
Yeah.
Like, we click sometimes, but it's how you recover.
Yeah.
It's how you own that. And I think the old school kind of teacher student relationship was, I'm the adult, you have to call me miss
Mm.
something, you have to respect me
I'm your
because,
mother. Yeah.
yeah, because I'm the adult. Whereas I don't think that works. That's the authoritarian kind of stance, and it's an oppressive kind of stance. And I don't think that works. So until we have a mutual respect with each other, I think, it's difficult to work because you don't
Do
want
you
to.
feel we're do you feel we're changing as a society where we're trying to see children as adults so we can have that really lovely flourishing relationship with kids? Or do you feel it's like 2 steps forward, 10 steps back?
I think there's like a mixture of, because obviously kids need to be taught things because they
Mm.
aren't adults and they don't know
Yeah.
everything. They need to be guided with boundaries and, taught different things. But I think there's definitely a shift in perspective around collaborative learning rather than you have to listen to me because I said so kind of learning.
Mm. Consequences. Yeah. Yeah. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I have loved every minute of, and it really just reinforces the idea of connection, building relationships, building that rapport before even addressing any learning goal or communication goal. Because once you have that connection, I always say the world is your oyster.
Yes.
With your business, if anyone wants to reach out for you, what could you offer to support families?
So I do tutoring locally. I do
Mhm.
kind of mentoring, tutoring, depending on the student. Um, I do education consulting. So whether that's around choosing the right school, understanding the system, um, understanding how to work with your child to get the best out of them educationally. And then I guess on the other side of things, I will be able to kind of offer support for schools or businesses on how to understand trauma and how to understand how to work with young people from trauma or from a disability background. I've done some trainings in the past around working with kids with ASD or working with kids with ODD and really understanding how we differentiate our practice and our speaking to work with different diverse young
Mm.
people.
And can you see participants on the NDIS?
Yeah, it's definitely
Yeah.
something I can do.
And then full fee paying. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is remarkable. Thank you for being such a wonderful individual in society. I feel like there needs to be more of what you do and educating every individual about the importance of trauma informed practice and understanding behavior. You mentioned I just want to touch base on something which is really I'm passionate about, the idea of COVID.
Yes.
And yes, we got sidetracked. What's your what's your intake or outtake? Outtake is the word? Is that the word?
Int- yeah.
What's your point of view of what COVID has done or influenced young kids? And why do you think that's the case? I
Um,
have my 2 cents worth.
yeah, I mean, I could get in trouble for saying this, but I think
That's what
my
I just respectfully,
yeah,
respectfully.
no. I think my personal opinion is that, a system can influence the way you live,
Mhm.
and we need to be aware and question systems. And I think that's uniform across all systems.
Yeah.
It definitely made me think way more and way deeper into systems and why they're built and what they're designed to do, but
Mhm.
also to question everything a little bit more. Um, and I think it was very interesting for me to see a lot of kids from a trauma informed background, not trauma informed background, from a trauma background, could see different things and could
Mm.
question things a little more than other kids that I had worked with. And I think it's because they have already been in a system that's failed them and they're, not too trusting of systems. So they were like asking a few more questions. And I
Mm.
think it's definitely triggered me to ask more questions and to kind of fight systems a little bit more, because just because something's written in policy or because someone says you have to do something because it's a rule, like rules change all the time, doesn't mean we shouldn't question them. Like it used to um, be illegal for men in different states of America to have a moustache. It used to
Mm.
be it used to be legal to smoke while you were pregnant and, drink while you were pregnant. Like there's different rules that change with society. And I think it's important that to advocate for kids in foster care or kids with a disability, sometimes we have to fight those rules.
Yeah, because those rules don't align to make them better.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
systems are
Interesting.
uniform, but they don't fit everything and they're not for everyone.
Interesting. You have that aspect. I'm coming from the aspect of how much I feel it's impacted social development and communication development
That
because there was
too.
reduced interaction, reduced social interaction with adults, and so much more of this phone screen stuff, which is not natural. And so I feel we've
Yeah.
lost the foundations of naturalistic communication
Yeah,
because of environmental factors. Yeah.
and on that side of it, I feel like, kids, because it was about a 2-year period of
Yeah.
online, offline type learning, 2 years is a stage of development in terms of
Yeah.
an education system. So whether you're in year 1, kindergarten, preschool, you missed 2 stages of development
Mm,
in terms
mm,
of education. So, when a kid moves schools, usually they lose about 6 months of learning. If you've missed 2
mm.
years of learning, that's about 4 years of learning potentially, because you're starting back in year 4 when you're supposed to be in year 1. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I
It's
think we
crazy.
lost a
It's a whole
lot.
new stage of learning, yeah. Even when a
Yeah.
mother's pregnant, if she's pregnant during COVID, that would have played a substantial impact on her on the baby's development too.
Yeah, I mean, I had a friend that was pregnant during the time, and she said it was one of the hardest times of her life. Her partner
Mm.
couldn't go in the same room as the baby. They separated her baby from her and wouldn't let her be with the baby for different appointments. And I think and she was a new mum, being a new mum is kind of a
Exhausting,
big life
freaky,
change in
scary.
itself.
Yeah,
And if you don't have connection, that really kind of, you can't even have your partner in there, or you can't even,
yeah,
speak to people properly because you had a mask on. And
yeah,
yeah, I think it was and I think people are less connected now. I think people are more
100%.
connected,
Yeah.
via social media, but I feel like that's a new type of connection.
It's not healthy. I don't know,
Yeah.
it's not healthy at all. I mentioned this on a previous podcast. In the past, obesity was a crisis and an epidemic. I genuinely feel now loneliness is an epidemic, and we are lacking connection. And I guess the statistics of the increase of mental health challenges in society is a reflection of we are lacking the connection that we need as humans. And so let's start reflecting and how can we encourage more social interactions with one another to not only support our social well-being but also our emotional and mental well-being too.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
'Cause it's kind of
Lorna,
conditioned.
this yeah, it's conditioned. We should just have a wine with Wita off the mic and discuss this stuff later. But Lorna, it was genuinely a joy working with you and talking with you today. And kudos to Gabby for bringing us together, because what we do enjoy, we will just get more of it. And so I hope many people listening today understand that behavior is communication and connection creates relationships. Before I finish up, Lorna, I always ask all my guests, if you were to apply one word for the day to make yourself a better version tomorrow, what would your word be?
Hmm. Self-awareness.
Ooh, care to talk
2
about that? That's my
2
first
words.
time anyone said that. That's okay. You can use a hyphen.
Yeah. I guess if we don't know ourselves, it's hard to connect with other people. And if we're not aware of why we do things we do, we might interpret someone else's behavior as something that it's not.
Mm, self-awareness. Lovely.
It's just what came
I
to
might
my
need
mind.
it.
It might not be
No,
good.
that's awesome. I love that. It got me thinking, definitely. Well, thank you, Lorna, for being a guest on Wine with Wita, and I hope you have an amazing night. And thank you, everyone, for listening. I look forward to bringing you wonderful connections and useful insights to support you and your child on this gorgeous journey that you're on. Take care, everyone, and see you soon. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Wine with Wita. I hope you found some new inspiration, learnt something new, or gained a fresh perspective. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be so grateful if you please leave a 5-star review, as it really helps the show get in the ears of new listeners, plus it takes 5 seconds. If you're keen for more strategies and insights, then head over to Instagram and follow RS Speech Pathology.